Good evening. My name is Joe Kim, and on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to welcome you to the Education and Cognition Public Lecture, which closes out a busy day one at the 9th Annual McMaster Conference on Education and Cognition. Thank you to all our campus partners, including the McPherson Institute for Innovation and Excellence in Teaching and Learning, the Faculty of Science, the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience and Behavior, the Alumni Association, and the Office of the President for their ongoing support to make these events possible. Introducing tonight's speaker is Dean Maureen MacDonald. Dr. Maureen MacDonald is the first woman to serve as the Dean of Science at McMaster University. The faculty is the largest at McMaster, with nearly 7,500 undergraduate and graduate students and 300 faculty members and staff. Maureen's research focuses on cardiovascular health, exercise physiology, spinal cord injury, and aging. And with a team of more than 20 students, Maureen leads important research into the effectiveness of exercise as a way of preventing illness, improving health status, and lifestyle.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, Joe. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our McMaster Conference on Education and Cognition. We are thrilled to have a record turnout for this year's public lecture. And in this remote environment, we have an international audience, all of whom share the same passion for excellence in teaching and learning as we do. While we're meeting together online tonight, I would like to begin our lecture with a land acknowledgement. This acknowledgement will show respect for Indigenous peoples and their enduring connection with their traditional territories and histories. We are guests on the territory where we currently have the privilege to study, live, and work. And it's important to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land, and the history they share with the land is a step towards reconciliation. At McMaster University and in the Faculty of Science, we are committed to the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. We hope to foster an environment where all our stakeholders are aware of and serious about reconciliation. While giving a land acknowledgement is one step towards reconciliation, it's important to recognize that it is only one step, and it is only one step towards equity and inclusion. We acknowledge the traditional territories here in Hamilton upon which we gather. McMaster University is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. That wampum uses the symbolism of a dish to represent the territory, and one spoon to represent that the people are to share the resources of the land and only take what they need from the dish. For many thousands of years, the first people sought to walk gently on this land. They offered their assistance to the first European travelers and shared their knowledge for survival in what was at times a very harsh climate. As a descendant of those European settlers, I acknowledge how important it is for us to seek a new relationship with the original peoples of the land. That new relationship should be based on honor and deep respect. I am hopeful that it will be guided by love and right action as we transform our personal and institutional relationships with our Indigenous friends and neighbors, and in our interactions with each other in this public lecture today. Before introducing our keynote speaker, I would like to personally thank the amazing McMaster team who organized our public lecture and the entire EdCog conference. Thank you to my colleagues, Dr. Joe Kim, Dr. Michelle Cabdieu, Dr. Irina Gillick, and Dr. Constance Imbald, as well as our technical assistants from Paulina Rezkova, as well as Dave Dawson. This is our second virtual EdCog conference to be held during the pandemic. The team is looking to move to a hybrid model post-pandemic, combining the best features of online and in-person conferences. Record turnout is one of the best features of a virtual conference. So too is assembling a roster of outstanding, smart, engaging, and wonderful presenters from around the world. And that brings me to tonight's keynote speaker. Dr. James Lang is a professor of English and the director of the Damour Center for Teaching Excellence at Assumption University in Worcester, Massachusetts. Dr. Lang is the author of 6 books, including Distracted, Why Students Can't Focus and What You Can Do About It, which was published last October. You can also read Jim's monthly column on teaching and learning in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Jim has conducted workshops on teaching for faculty at more than 100 colleges, universities, and high schools. He's consulted with the United Nations on a multi-year project to develop teaching materials in ethics and integrity for high school and college faculty members. He is the recipient of a Fulbright Specialist Grant and was the 2019 Paul Ziegler Presidential Award for Excellence in Scholarship at Assumption University. And if that wasn't impressive enough, Jim and his wife Anne established the Lang Family Foundation. Jim donates a significant portion of his writing and speaking income. These donations provide foundation grants to nonprofits that are alleviating poverty and homelessness and supporting the environment. Anne and Jim's foundation also supports libraries and public education. I'd say you're certainly doing your part to advance our society, Jim. Thank you so much for making such a difference in your community and so many communities, and for sharing your expertise and passion for teaching and learning with us this evening. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you to everybody for joining us here today. Thank you to Maureen and Joe and Connie and everyone who has helped put this together. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk with everyone tonight about distraction and attention in this year of many distractions. My wife is a kindergarten teacher, and so for most of the year the kindergarten was happening remotely. So this is the office in which I work, and about 10 feet away she was teaching remote kindergarten. So all day long I would be listening to songs about the weather and the alphabet. So I'm very familiar with the problem of sort of being distracted, not only for our students, but for those of us who teach and do other kinds of work over the course of this very challenging year that we have had. However, I'm going to tell you right up front that our goal tonight is not so much to talk about distraction, but to talk about attention and the role that attention plays in learning, and how we can cultivate attention through the structures that we use in education, through the ways that we design and teach our classes, and through the ways that we attend to one another as individuals and humans. So my goal actually really is to kind of turn your heads away from distraction and turn them instead toward attention and toward creative thinking about how do we cultivate, support, and sustain attention in education. So that's really the goal of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I will say, because I know we have a mixed audience here, folks from educators, teachers, parents, that most of my research emerges from both the literature but also from college and university and secondary school classrooms. The principles, I think, are ones that apply to any sort of context, but people might have to think about how to apply them outside of those specific contexts. You might have to think a little bit more creatively about that. And I will say also that my research doesn't specifically address students with attention challenges or disorders. Again, though, some of the recommendations that I'm going to make emerge from sort of best practices that educators use with those students. And so again, people will have to kind of think about how to apply it to those contexts, if those are the contexts you're interested in. And of course, we can certainly we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end, and you're welcome to raise those kinds of questions in the final part. Okay, so normally when as someone who has written about attention and distraction, I don't give sort of like a whole keynote without a talk, without a break. However, in this case, because this is a public lecture, I'm going to try to limit. I'm going to talk, try to limit it to about 40 minutes. Keep it nice and lively, and that we'll have plenty, and we'll still have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions and conversation. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get started and share my screen. We are going to talk here about teaching distracted minds. And the reason I choose that title is because, as I'm going to argue shortly, a distracted mind is a human mind. All of our minds are distractible and distracted, not just today, but historically that has been the case. And so when we think about how to teach to a distracted mind, we're just thinking about how to teach to a human mind, but it gives us an interesting and creative new lens into the educational process. Now, I'd like to actually start the talk by thinking about sort of the role that attention plays in education from like a more philosophical perspective. And Yves Citone's book, The Ecology of Attention, gives me a nice avenue for doing that. Because I like the way he phrases it here. That teaching's essential task consists in heightening the ability of students to notice what's remarkable and important in what they're looking at. And so as a result, what we might recognize here is that teaching is the art of directing attention. Right? So all of our fields are kind of these vast terrains on which we could teach, thousands and thousands of potential things. And one of the first things that we do as teachers is we try to identify the ones that are most essential for our students to learn, and we orient their attention to them. Right? So I do this in my field of literature, choosing from many thousands of works of literature, narrowing them down to the ones I want my students to read and learn. And I also, even within the works of literature themselves, will try to orient their attention to the key parts and passages. So in that sense, I'm a director of their attention, and we all might think about ourselves, those of us who are educators and even parents, as directing the attention of our students, our children, to the things that matter. Now, having recognized that we are directors of attention, we immediately come across a very fundamental challenge. And that is the challenge that neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists will tell us when we even dip a toe into the research on attention and distraction. The human attention is a very limited capacity resource, as Michelle Miller here argues in her book, Minds Online. Within our cognitive system, attention is a precious, limited resource. So anyone who designs a learning experience has to think about ourselves as stewards of the limited stores of our students' attention. And the question that we're going to raise here tonight and try to answer is, how good stewardship are we offering to our students? Are we being good stewards of their attention, and how could we get better? How could we do a better job of stewarding the limited stores of our students' attention? Okay, so that's kind of the setup here and kind of the big thinking about attention and the role it plays in education. And we're now going to step back just for a few minutes to notice what writers, thinkers, philosophers have said about attention and distraction, what they've been saying about it for a very long time. And what you're going to find here is that although we tend to think about distraction as a very contemporary problem, people have been talking about it for as long as we have been talking about our minds. And so we can go back here right from the start to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, writing well over 2,000 years ago. And in his book, The Ethics, Aristotle has this quote: "People who are passionately devoted to the flute find it hard to pay attention to arguments when they hear someone playing that flute, because they enjoy that flute playing more than the listening to that argument." And I want you to substitute here sitting in class for listening to an argument and watching a YouTube video for listening to a flute, right? Aristotle's point here is a very simple one. When we're doing something that's cognitively challenging, like trying to follow an argument, if something easy comes along that's more pleasant to us or that we would enjoy more, we distract ourselves with that other thing. Aristotle says at one other point in the Ethics that when people go to the theater and the acting is bad, they're more likely to start eating their snacks, right? So if what we're dealing with is cognitively challenging, or if we don't find it interesting, we go to our distractions. And this is Aristotle talking about this well over 2,300 years ago, actually. So we can see right away that the problem of distraction is a pretty ancient one. Now, in the book that I have written about this, I kind of go through a lot more of this. For the purposes of time, I'm going to kind of skip through just a couple more examples of this. And we're actually going to go forward about 2,000 years to the English writer Isaac Watts, who in the 18th century wrote a self-help manual called The Improvement of the Mind. And you might know during this time period in Europe, coffee shops had sprung up everywhere. There were these sort of buzzing, caffeinated sites of excitement. People would get the news there, meet one another, conduct business, all kinds of stuff. And Isaac Watts tells to his readers in The Improvement of the Mind, don't go to coffee shops to do your work or to try to study or learn or whatever it might be. Because once you're there, you're going to find yourself distracted by all that stuff, and that is going to turn you into a distractible person. So you can see his quote here from The Improvement of the Mind. Don't choose your place of study by going to the most various and entertaining scenes where things are going to strike your eye and your ear and have the tendency to steal the mind away from its steady pursuit of a subject. And I especially want you to notice the last part of that quote, because the story we get now is, oh, well, we're all so distracted by our phones these days, it's shortening our attention span. This external thing is destroying my internal attention span. That's exactly what Isaac Watts is saying right here, right? If you spend a lot of time in the company of your distractions, your soul becomes a distractible thing, right? So that same concern that we have now, Isaac Watts is expressing 250 years ago. Now I'm going to fast forward just one more time, another 150 years, to 1906. The British satirical magazine Punch, at the end of 1906, publishes a series of cartoons that are like forecasts for the next year, like end-of-the-year forecasts. And in this end-of-the-year forecast, they have a cartoon which shows what they believe is going to happen with the then most modern technology in terms of its ability to destroy people's attention spans. And you can see here in the cartoon that's what's happening is people are so engrossed by their personal telegraph machines that they're not paying attention to one another, right? The woman is getting a love note, and the guy is checking the sports scores. And you can easily envision this sort of transposed right to a modern quad today, right, where two students are sitting at a dining hall table looking at their phones, and there's some caption about how they don't communicate with one another anymore because of their phones, right? So again, well over 100 years ago, we were expressing this same concern about the role that technology has in interfering with our communication with one another and like absorbing us into these digital, these shiny technological digital devices. So all of this is a lead up to a quote from Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows. And what Nicholas Carr argues here is that calm, focused, undistracted, these linear minds that we had before the internet are being pushed aside by this new kind of mind that wants to, short, disjointed, overlapping bursts. And what those previous 3 slides were designed to show you is we never had calm, focused, undistracted, and linear minds, right? We can see that going back well over 2,000 years, people complaining about their distractibility. So what Nicholas Carr is doing here, and some other people who write about this, is kind of imagining there was this sort of attentional Garden of Eden that we used to live in, where we could just sort of calmly sit and focus. But that never seems to have been the case. We've always been easily distractible creatures, and so we want to be able to kind of step back a little bit from some of these kinds of arguments that say somehow the internet or our devices or new technologies are destroying our attention spans, right? Our attention spans seem to have always been on the verge of being destroyed, or that we have these fears about our attention spans being destroyed. Now, that raises a good question though, because in almost all these comments about our attention, we seem to be lamenting it. We wish we could pay better attention. And so that raises an interesting question here. Why are we distracted? What causes our distractibility? There's a lot and lots of research here, so for purposes here to kind of get to the education part of this, I'm not going to go very deeply into this, but I just want to point out what I would call a push and a pull factor. The push factor that pushes us away from our things that we're trying to pay attention to, and the pull factor that draws us, in particular, toward our distractions, and in particular our digital devices. So just 2 quick things here. The push factor, I want you to just sort of recognize as something that you'll all know from personal experience, is that our attention fatigues. Paying attention is challenging to us, especially to something like listening to an argument or sitting in a class, and it fatigues and wears down, it degrades over time. We've all had this experience, right? You're able to pay better attention to me right now than you will be in 30 minutes if I were to just keep talking. And so that, because our ability to pay attention gradually sort of wears down over time. There's a beautiful illustration of this in a study that came out a few years ago, which looked at how long students watched video lectures in 4 very large open online courses that had been conducted over many years, and that in fact had millions of users go through them. So the researchers were able to look at a huge data set here, comparing, okay, given how long the video lectures are in these courses, how long do people actually watch them, right? And so they were able to tell this. They ultimately had 7 million data points to look at, and this is what they found. When the videos were up to about 10 minutes in length, as you can see here, for the most part, people watched all of them. And after that, boy, does it dive off a cliff, right? So down when you're getting lecture videos of 30 or 40 minutes, people are barely watching any of them. This is a really good, simple illustration of the fact that our directed attention, which is what you're doing with me right now, paying sort of directed attention, it fatigues. So that's the thing that kind of pushes us away oftentimes from situations in which we're paying attention, want to pay attention, or want others to pay attention. At the same time, there is a factor that sort of pulls us toward especially our digital devices. And what pulls us toward those digital devices is that we, like other primates, are incredibly curious creatures. And our brains reward us for encountering novelty and getting new information, right? And so scanning our environment for new information, looking around, taking in new things, noticing novelty, this is hardwired into us because it was helpful to us for our survival. And so as Adam Gazzaley, a neuroscientist, and Larry Rosen, a psychologist, point out in their book, The Distracted Mind, which is a great layperson's overview of distraction and attention, at our core, we are information-seeking creatures. And these mechanisms in our brain that developed to support food foraging now have evolved in primates like us to include information foraging. so that our brains kind of give us that little burst of pleasure from seeing novelty, from encountering new information, from getting new ideas and information. And so, that is something that we are kind of built with. The challenge that we face today is that we all have endless novelty machines in our pockets and available to us at all times. Nir was a video game designer who ultimately wrote a book called Hooked, which was a book for companies to learn and understand how to capture and keep the attention of a human being in an app or a digital device. And what's striking when you read the book is how well versed he is in the literature of neuroscience and cognitive psychology. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry with lots of smart people trying to engineer these devices in ways that play on our distractible brains and that give us the novelty that we're seeking. And if you think about what this device does, it's designed for endless novelty, right? I can look at my email on there, then I can check to see if I have any text, then I can look at Twitter, then I can look at Instagram, then I can check the weather, and by the time that's all done, I probably have new email, right? So it's an endless cycle for me of being able to just sit there, which is why we're able to sit there with it for such a long time, because it's giving us these sort of frequent bursts of information that our brains like, that were ultimately kind of designed for our environment, to kind of help us succeed in our environment, but now are kind of being translated into this other context. Okay, so all of this has been designed to kind of lead to one point, and this is the point this is the primary thing I want you to take away from this talk tonight. Whether the specific things resonate with you or not that I'm going to talk about in the second part, this is the main idea. We tend to think about attention is the norm and distraction is like the falling away from that norm. But I'm going to argue that a deep dive into the literature on attention and distraction shows us that the opposite is actually true. That attention is an achievement, and it's one that we have to work at and that we should not take for granted. As Daniel Reisberg argues here, we need to think about attention as an achievement, something that we can do, but not that we do effortlessly. And lots of things need to happen for it to fall into place. And you'll notice here he separates that into at least two different things. To be aware of the thing that we're trying to pay attention to, and then to block out the other stuff. These are actually two separate processes in our brains. And one of the reasons we know that is because as we get older, our ability to focus on something can remain consistent. Our ability to block out external stimuli actually degrades as we age. So you might have noticed yourself, or you might have noticed in sort of older people, parents, or relatives, that in a crowded restaurant they might have trouble focusing on the conversation. That's not because they can't focus, it's because they have trouble blocking out all that ambient noise going on around them and all the kind of stimulation going on around them. So that shows us about, that's at least two different things that have to happen for us to achieve attention, and there are other parts of our brain that kind of have to work and help us achieve attention. Now, what we're going to do here, so that's the end of kind of the first big part of the talk. In the second part now, we're going to go to what helps achieve attention, and I'm going to show some recommendations for that. But I do want you to, as you kind of go back and after this lecture tonight, and you're going back into whatever context you're working or want to apply these ideas in, to think about this from your own personal perspective. What helps you achieve attention? What are the kind of contexts in which you pay attention, and what lesson can you draw from that for your students or your children, whatever it might be, right? And start talking with other people about this. And this is how I started the process of doing this research myself, is just thinking about, okay, where do people pay attention? What are the kind of situations in which we see people really locked in and focused? And what are the conditions that create that? That's what we really have to think about for the people whose attention we are trying to cultivate. And so that's something that we can all continue to do on our own. Okay, having said all that, I'm now going to focus on three things. So we got three parts left here in the second half. And so we're going to talk about the reciprocity of attention. We're going to talk about the structure of a learning experience and how that can support attention. And lastly, we're going to talk about the renewal of attention. Because one thing we know for sure about attention, I've already mentioned, it fatigues. And it's also dulled down by familiarity and routine. So what are the things that we can do when attention is flagging or failing in order to renew it, to awaken students, for example, to the wonders of our course content? Okay, so what do I mean by reciprocity here. What I mean by that is attention is a mutually shared value. And what I mean by that is, I can say even more simply, we pay attention to the people that pay attention to us. Right? We have all had the experience, I'm sure, especially those of us who are parents. Right? I have 5 children, and in their teens and early 20s, so I have this experience all the time of trying to talk to someone who is lost in their device. Right? And we, of course, when that happens, we kind of separate ourselves from that conversation versus a conversation in which someone is paying close attention to you, looking you in the eye, and those are the moments in which we sort of give that attention back. So we have to recognize that as teachers, one of the most important things, the first and most important things we have to do, if we want the attention of our students, is give our attention to them. And there are a few different ways that we can do this. But I just want to give one quick sort of note here as an introduction to this. My daughter, my third daughter, started college last year. She was nervous, like all college students were, especially starting in the pandemic. She was on campus, but most of her classes were remote. One of the teachers had wanted the students to contribute to a discussion board, and so what she did was, throw out a discussion board question. She asked students to post. My diligent daughter, who is the child of 2 teachers, was the first one to jump on there and post something, and the teacher sent out a note to the other students saying, hey everyone, remember to post the discussion board, and thanks to Jillian for getting the conversation started. And this was the text that my wife and I got with the screenshot of that email. Check this out, my professor gave me a shout out, right? And it wasn't like the professor even praised the post, but she had just taken the time to notice and name my daughter. And that was an incredibly affirming thing for my daughter, to notice that this sort of remote authority figure, who in her first days at college had paid attention to her. And it really stuck out for her and made a difference in her sort of early experience at college. So what are some of the ways that we can pay attention to our students and demonstrate this reciprocal value of attention? First of all, names. Names are absolutely essential for attention. So the cocktail party effect is something that psychologists talk about as our ability to pay selective attention. If you're at a cocktail party, your ability to pay attention to a person while there's all kinds of other stuff going on is one of the sort of striking and positive features of our attention. But there's a corollary which they often talk about, which is if you're in a conversation group, talking to people, paying selective attention, and someone across the room says your name, you will tune that in. Our names are incredibly powerful in grabbing our attention. So, if I had a list of participants in this webinar right now and I started saying a few names, the people whose names I said, didn't matter what they were doing. They could be on their phone while they're listening to me. They're going to pop up as soon as they hear their names, right? So one of the first things that we want to do is make sure that we are using student names in classes. As we invite students into the conversation, as we work with them in groups, using their names. In large classes, just having students put placards out so that even if we don't remember their names, we can still use them. There's a great study which showed this in a very large class of 300 students. When students had name placards out, the students felt more connected to the instructors and thought that the instructors knew them personally, even when the instructors afterwards were shown a roster and couldn't actually remember the student's name. The students had the impression that the instructors knew their name and were giving them more of that individual attention. For those of us who are teaching online and use discussion boards, for example, one easy thing we can do is after each of those discussion board posts is done, identify a few students who did a great job, make a short video or if it's in class, and name them, right? And say, hey, I appreciate your discussion board post. There were 3 really good ones this time that I want to just note and encourage everyone to go look at. This was one of my favorite things that I had read in a book about online teaching just after the pandemic that I started doing, and it really made a difference for me in feeling connected to the students, and I hope them feeling connected to the class. Not only should we be using their names, but we should be encouraging them to learn one another's names. So make this a value in your class and make it a regular practice, and be deliberate about it. The use of student names and names as we interact with other people. Your name is a great grabber of attention. Another great grabber of attention in a physical classroom, and this is what, in my view, one of the sort of lowest hanging fruits of attention, is the physical presence, is the way our physical presence can invite attention. I was on our promotion and tenure committee for a couple of years. I observed lots and lots of classes, dozens of classes on my campus. And one of the things I noticed was that about 75 to 80% of those classes, there was like an invisible barrier that the teacher stood behind and the students were out there in the seats, and the teacher never crossed that line. One of the easiest ways to get someone to pay attention, students, is to stand near them, right? So use your physical presence to invite students into the conversation. Be physically present with them, not in a menacing or a looming way, but just to come out and say, hey, I want to be involved with this, right? This is a community that we're in together, and I'm going to invite you in by sort of going to the different corners of the room and making sure that I'm present and with all of the different students. One of the things that someone taught me early in my career was before each new class starts, go into the room when it's empty and walk around. Go to all corners of it. Stand in different parts of it. Get used to noticing, like if I'm here, can I see my slides? What is this student here getting blocked out of? And sort of be present across that whole room so that when you actually get in there with your students, it feels normal to you to be moving around and be inviting students into the conversation with your presence as well as with your words. The last example I want to give here in terms of the reciprocity thing is a more kind of philosophical one, and one to do at the beginning of a class, which is to invite students to share their talents and strengths with you. There's been a lot of interesting research on values affirmations, which are invitations for students to tell you what matters to them before a class begins. And this research has shown that these values affirmations can have a really positive impact on performance and retention of students, especially traditionally underrepresented students in higher education. For example, first-generation students or female students in STEM courses. So this is a very simple activity in which you can simply invite students at the beginning of a class to share their strengths and talents with you by answering these kinds of questions. Once you have gathered the answers to these kinds of questions from students, you can use them throughout the semester, right? To notice, for example, when something comes along that a student has a particular strength or talent at, you can invite them to share that or put that to work. I did this with my students for the first time as a result of this research just at the semester in which the pandemic hit. And it was an absolute joy to read what students told me about what they were good at, including many of them had told me, you know, I'm not that great of a writer, but I'm really good at leading group discussions. I'm not that great as a discussion in discussions, but I'm good at like tutoring other students in the class, right? So I found out all kinds of great things about my students, and these affirmations help you recognize each student as an individual and give you an opportunity to engage with them at another level. So the reciprocity of attention is the first thing that we want to think about here. How do we pay attention to students in a way that invites their attention back to us? If we want their attention, we need to make sure that we are giving them our attention. The second thing we're going to talk about here is designing for attention. So as we think about how to structure a learning experience, what does it mean to design for attention? And so typically, what we're thinking about when we design a class for students is what content are my students going to learn? But I would argue there's an equally important question to ask as if we're thinking about attention, which is what are my students going to be doing? And how is there going to be a regular sort of cycle and routine of doing that is going to keep attention up and sustained throughout the class period? Now, I had a great example of, I went to a workshop a few years ago that really helped me think through this question. The workshop was called Inspired by Index Cards, and it was based on a workshop that had been developed by Kimberly Tanner, a biologist. And what this workshop leader did was she invited us to write down on index cards all the different stuff that we did in class. So example, not the content, like what were the pedagogical things that we did? Like, as you can see here on my cards, mini lectures. I have my students do short writing activities. I might have them do a group worksheet. I might show a short video. I had like 10 or 12 of these sort of technique type things. She then said to us, okay, I want you to think about the next class that you're teaching, and I want you to pull 3 or 4 cards and sequence them. And see what it's like to sequence them in the way that's going to best promote the learning of your students. And at this time I was kind of already thinking about this book, and so it made me think, what's the sequence here that's going to promote attention? What's the sequence of like active versus passive things, individual versus group things? How am I going to make sure that I'm kind of actively moving my students through these different modules rather than just sort of hammering them with content throughout the entire class period? This was a real eye-opener for me. It's something I really recommend that the teachers do as well. Thinking about all the different things you do, laying them out like this, because what the instructor then did next was even more interesting. She said, okay, take that same class period and reshuffle them. Put them in a new order and see what does it look like to put those cards in a different kind of order. That was really illuminating, to start to notice then, how is the sequencing of what's going on in class designed to either support attention or something that I'm just ignoring and not worrying about, and then just being upset when student attention isn't sustained throughout the class period. So what does it look like for you to design a class period with attention in mind, and to combine that question about what am I teaching with how am I sort of moving my students through the class period? I would argue we need to think here like playwrights, right? Plays have acts and scenes and intermissions. They have rising and falling action. They have variety. And so we need to think about how do we design a class period that takes advantage of that same sequencing of variety and change, right? Variety and change are great rejuvenator of attention. So how can we build that kind of change into our class period? This is one great way to do it. I'll just note that you might want to pay special attention to a few key moments. First of all, the opening. I have a colleague who, every time students come into the class, she's a microbiologist, she shows them a slide with a microbe on it, and the first thing that students do every day is do a quick Google search on that microbe and see what they can find. And it's a great way to sort of start off with engagement rather than coming in and talking to students for a half an hour and then asking them questions, right? Right from the get-go, her students are engaged, then she goes to her lecture, and then might do discussion or something else afterwards. But I think to get students' attention from the beginning, we need to engage them for the beginning. So what would be your opening engagement activity of the day? And could you pair that with a closing engagement activity? Here's some great questions that some instructors at Villanova University in the United States ask their students at the end of class. One thing I learned from our class readings, one thing I learned from today's class, and what am I unclear or would like to know more about? These are very simple questions designed to kind of seal up learning. And they do a great job of, once again, making sure the end of class is not like, I'm just going to keep talking and talking and talking till the last minute, right? And then off you go, packing up your backpacks and everything. No, they force me to be deliberate, to think about that sequencing, to stop 5 minutes early, and to get my students engaged again at the end, instead of just slowly drifting away and then walking out the door to their next thing. So I would argue the beginning and ending are really key moments for engagement. And somewhere along the way, I'm going to argue as well in a class, it's worth having some kind of low stakes assessment. When our students are navigating so many different classes, so much going on in the world, a pandemic and their particular challenges they're facing, all kinds of stuff, assessments help draw the attention of students to the place where it's going to matter the most. So putting a small amount of stakes on something signals to the students this is important. And if it's well designed, right, that's only going to help the student. If I sort of draw their attention to an activity by putting a small amount of credit on it, right, I'm showing the students this is important. And that activity, if well designed, is only going to help them be successful in the class. So, for example, in my classes, students often do group annotations of a poem, which is what you see here. Instead of grading students on like participation, like raising their hands or stuff like that, which many of us do, create an engagement grade and base that engagement grade on the completion of concrete in-class activities like these kinds of worksheets or poll questions or problem solving or whatever it might be, and give full presence for credit for presence and completion. I want you to imagine that student in the back of the room who comes into class, is tired, has got a lot going on, and you say, okay, we're going to do this today, and that student just says, you know what, I don't have it today. But if you incentivize that student just a little bit to say, okay, all you have to do is engage here and complete this, and you're going to get credit for this today, that just might be the thing that student needs to get over the hump, to actively participate and attend, and that's going to make a positive difference to that student in the course. So, the beginning, the end, and something in the middle here that's a low stakes engagement grade, and that can be as low as possible. Just you do it, you check off, you get your credit. The last thing I'll just say about structure is make it visible, right? So like, one of the things that's very challenging for us in an environment when people are talking to us, like I'm doing to you right now, is following the structure. And we spend a lot of time in these kinds of contexts thinking, how long is this going on? How much time is there left? What part are we in, right? When someone doesn't show us that stuff, that's eating up some of our attentional resources. So take that off the table and make it very visible to your learners Here's what's exactly going to happen, and here's how we're going to walk through it. And by the way, we're in part 2 right now, and we're going to get part 3, right? So like for you, as you know, we're in the second half of the lecture. We're just finishing the second part. We're about to do the third and final part of part 2, right? So like that's the kind of place where our attention, when we're listening to a talk or a lecture or an experience like this, those are the moments in which our attention perks back up and we realize, oh, okay, right. I've only got a few more minutes here to pay attention, and then I'm going to get a break, right? So be transparent about that structure. Write it on the board, put it on a slide, show your learner exactly how the class is going to unfold. Okay, finally, renewal. And what I like to talk about here are what I call signature attention activities, creative pedagogical techniques to renew attention when it has flagged. And this is my favorite part of this research, is finding these great activities. I'm going to show you 4 of them and then hope that you can think about how you might create your own or translate some of these into your own context. So these are creative teachers who are thinking about the fact that attention is hard for their students and want to get their students to pay close attention to essential course content. So what did they do? Okay, 4 examples. First one is my favorite. It comes from an art history teacher across town from me at the College of Holy Cross, who has her students go to the local art museum every week for 13 weeks and write a new 2-page essay about the same painting. 13 essays they have to write about the same painting. What a creative way to get her students to think about and cultivate the value of attention. And so what she says about this is, you know, the students were very challenged by it at first. They struggled and struggled, but as they learned new content each week and applied it to that same object, they went deeper and deeper and recognized the true value of paying attention and really looking closely at something. So what's that essential thing for you that you want your students to go back to again, again, and again? And how could you structure some kind of activity or assignment in which students are doing that, right? So looking, and looking again. Second one is a theology teacher on my campus who wants her students to pay close attention to certain key aspects of the Bible. This is like the introduction to the Bible class. So she developed a really innovative strategy for doing that. 5 times a semester, her students sit down in pairs across from one another and are assigned a very short passage from the Bible, just a few paragraphs. And these are the instructions they're given. Read it really, really slowly. I don't care that you get through the whole thing. She actually tells them to stop after every sentence and think about these 3 questions. What do you notice? What do you make you think about? And what questions does it raise for you, right? So I was actually in class. I observed her students doing this. The students were reading the first few chapters of the book of Genesis. And so after the students do this for 20 minutes, then she says, okay, tell me what you heard, what you discovered. And one of the students said, you know, I've read this passage many times in my life, and it never occurred for me to ask, what does it mean for the earth to be formless? And another student sitting nearby went, pow, like their minds were being blown by the language of the book of Genesis, right? This is not something I had normally seen happening in introductory theology classes. So again, what would it look like to take your students to look really closely at some essential thing from your discipline, a text, an object, a theory, a problem, whatever it might be, and get them to work slowly through these questions on their own in pairs, and then invite them together to talk about what they have shared. Third thing, these connection notebooks. This is something I started doing myself several years ago. It's my favorite teaching technique, and it's designed to get students to see the content through a new lens, a new perspective that's going to reawaken or awaken their attention to something familiar that they might encounter in my class. Students actually come to class with a blue book, a blue exam book, every day. And once a week at the end of class, the students have to take out that blue book. And again, this is an ending thing for me, so it's like last 10 minutes of class. They have to take out that blue book, and they have to write a 1-paragraph response to a connection question. And these are what those questions, these are some examples of what those questions look like. So you can see here, these questions are designed to elicit like creative thinking about how something that we talked about in that class relates to something outside of it, something in their lives, something they've seen or encountered, something they've learned in another class. Whatever it might be, it's taking that new lens. And again, we know this is like for attention, right? You see something in one way over and over again, and then suddenly you see it from a new perspective, and your attention wakens back up again. This is designed to kind of have that awakening effect on the attention of students. So this is a kind of everyday thing that we could do with our students to invite this kind of new attention. And the fourth and final thing here is attending to our assessments and thinking creatively about the audience for our assessments. So much of our assessments are done for an audience of one, right? They're doing their tests for me, their papers for me. When they give presentations, they're supposed to be talking to the class, but usually they're looking right at me, right? So one great way to awaken attention to an assessment is to say, you know what, you're not going to do this for me. I want you to do this for this other audience. And we have excellent research, by the way, that when learners have to explain or teach something to someone else, it's one of the best ways to deepen their learning. So what would it look like to take one thing that your students normally do for you and orient it to another audience? What does that look like? Inspiring teacher on my campus, a biologist, gives his students a great assignment. You know, and this is done in what I call the trough of the semester, right? Weeks 10 to 12, where attention is really waning over the course of the semester. He tells his students, okay, I want you to find something that you're passionate or want to learn more about. And they've learned about water and its role in life in their class. They've learned about genetics, the role that genetics can play in genetically modified foods and food insecurity. So they can pick anything. They then pick an audience who they think should care or know more about that topic. And that might be their dorm mates or a sports team that they're on or their little siblings. It could be anybody. And the assignment is connect them. You deliver your interests to that audience. Find a way to educate that audience about the thing that you care about. Right? Students come up with all kinds of fabulous creative ideas as a result of this, and one of my favorites is some students wanted to educate their fellow students about the role that how much water gets used in showers and the impact that that had on the local water tables. So they created a poster campaign, and they hung posters in the bathrooms of all the dormitories on campus to educate their fellow students about showers and water usage. Now my colleague also assigns a short paper in which they explain what they did and why, and that gives him something consistent to grade. Here are our signature attention activities. So what does it look like for you to do this with your students or even your children, right? To get them to kind of reawaken their attention to something that's essential, or to awaken it for the first time. To look at something, to look at it again and again, each time with the perspective of the new things they're learning. Secondly, what do you notice? How can you invite really close and careful looking to some object that you train your students' attention to? Third, the connection notebooks, getting them deliberately to think about how course content connects outside of the class. And finally, translating, making at least maybe one assessment that you're going to be doing in your next class to a different audience, and inviting them to think creatively about how would I teach that audience about this subject matter. Okay, you have made it. We have made it to the end here, and so we're just about ready for questions and conversation. Just a few resources I'll recommend. You are welcome to join the conversation about teaching and learning and attention and distraction on Twitter there at my Twitter handle, Lang on Course. Kathy Davidson's great book, Now You See It, is a very good overview of attention and distraction in business, technology, life, everything. The Distracted Mind by Adam Gazzaley and Larry Rosen is a very good layperson's overview of attention and distraction in the human brain. And then in my book, I try to translate all of that for educators. So with that, I hope you're now going to get a break for your attention, and we have the opportunity to do some questions here. So I will look forward to seeing what folks have to say. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Jim. That was such a great, thoughtful talk to conclude our day one of the McMaster Conference on Education and Cognition. And yeah, just as you said, I think attention, like from a perspective of cognitive psychologists, it's the gateway to memory. And so if you're not focused and paying attention, you're not going to be learning and encoding memories for the long term. So we do have a number of questions submitted from our audience, and we'll have time to go through a few of them. So the first question concerns this global experience we've all gone through with the pandemic. And the question is, what might you recommend for students who are struggling with internal distractions caused by the pandemic, including stress and anxiety and feelings of being overwhelmed?
Yeah, I mean, and Joe, you're welcome to weigh in on these things yourself as well. I mean, Adam Gazzaley and Larry Rosen's book, first of all, I would really recommend that to people. And one of the things that they do is they kind of go through, like, what are the things that people are trying to do, like, in terms of, like, new research and everything, that would help people sort of improve their attentional capacities. So they go through a lot of stuff, drugs, games, all kinds of stuff. And they kind of evaluate these different categories to say, which one is the one, are any of these ones that we absolutely know helps improve our cognitive capacities? Then there are some that, like, maybe there's some research here, but it's not quite there yet. Of the 6 things they look at, there's only one thing they argue is absolutely research driven to help support and cultivate our attention, and it's physical activity, right? So, like, physical activity, we know that sends more blood to your brain. It's the best thing that we can do for to improve our cognitive functioning, actually. The brain games, all that kind of other stuff, maybe. But if you really want to go to thing that we know helps, get students, get people moving. Like, that's absolutely essential, and it may be one of the best things that we can do for our attention as well.
So there was a virtual hand clap from our dean, Maureen MacDonald, who is a kinesiologist and is also very interested in physical exercise and connections with mental health. And as an instructor, I'd say this of all years, like the pandemic, I don't think I've ever paid as much attention to student, mental health, well-being, and because when you're in the lecture hall, I think it's different, but online, like, I became much more aware of just the different struggles that people are going through. And I think you're right on talking about physical exercise. We've done some research as well, looking at how exercise breaks in particular seem to be effective compared to other types of breaks at helping people to pay better attention during extended study periods.
Yeah, and if you want to sort of really get the most bang from your buck, get out, do your exercise out in nature. Like, that seems, there's some research that suggests that is particularly restorative as well, actually.
Yeah, going out in nature, and there's also some really interesting work on high intensity interval training exercise. And we have a number of researchers at McMaster University, including Marty Gabala, who are actively studying the benefits of HIIT exercise. Okay, next question. Are there age differences in distraction tendencies, and how might we adjust for these in online teaching? So you mentioned that your wife is a kindergarten teacher. I'm really curious about how things are going with that online teaching.
So actually, there's a part of the book in which I talk about observing. Prior to the pandemic, when I was first starting the book, I went and volunteered in her classroom for a while. And boy, what an attentional nightmare that place was, right? Like, having to corral sort of 29 5-year-olds and keep their attention. Absolutely, there are developmental issues when it comes to attention. Our capacities to pay longer, to keep our focus for longer does obviously improve with age. We gain something from that, we lose something from that. What we gain from it is the ability to pay attention to, like, something like this and be able to read and do some of that kind of stuff. One thing that we lose from it, though, actually, is a child's mind is very kind of like that, all over the place, can sometimes lead to kind of creativity and, like, new ways of thinking about things. And so, distraction is not what we might think about as distraction is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it can lead to creative breakthroughs. Combining unusual things together, they're innovative ways. But for the kind of attention that we often want students to pay in school, absolutely, there are developmental issues, which is why I typically don't feel that comfortable addressing, like, attention in K-8 environments, because there are developmental issues there.
Okay, thank you. So on the flip side of the view that technology is destroying our attention span, there are some that talk about the so-called digital natives being better at multitasking compared to other generations of learners. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, not so much. I think the research is very clear on this. If you go into the research base, look up, the term digital natives was developed by someone who had no real like expertise in this area. It's not really based on any science. You know, if you've got children who are like teenagers or tweens, they can do some things great. My kids need my help like doing Microsoft Word. Like, it's not just because they know how to use their phone, it doesn't mean they know how to do other things when it comes to technology. So like, it's a very, in my view, that's a very misleading and actually in some ways harmful concept, because it puts this barrier between us and our students. Like, somehow they're fundamentally, like, architecturally different than we are. And the research just doesn't, I don't think it bears that out. And again, take the long view of sort of human evolutionary history, right? Like, these things developed over a very long period of time, right? In the course of 12, 15, 20 years, the architecture of our brain is not somehow diminishing as a result of digital technology. Now, maybe it will. Evolution continues, and so it might. We're not there yet. So I wouldn't worry about that, but I also wouldn't like take it for granted. I've had many experiences of students who like, I was like, okay, this is what we're going to do, and then afterwards realizing the students didn't know some basic technology thing that we were doing, and I just took it for granted that they did. So, you know, I'm not a believer in that argument. I think most of the research suggests that it's not really something that we should adapt.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you noted that attention should be seen as an achievement, and that sort of our default state would be mind wandering. So a question that that several people have asked about is there anything we could do to improve our limited attention span with training, with things like meditation and mindfulness?
I just finished an 8-week mindfulness class. I did write a little bit, and so what I have learned from that, unfortunately, it kind of affirms what I said in the book, which is, so there is a chapter on mindfulness in the book, and in that chapter I looked at the studies which have been done like in educational contexts, where like, for example, often, you know, many teachers have experimented with the idea of doing like a 5-minute meditation or breathing activity at the start of class. We actually did a large grant-funded study on my own campus. I was one of the principal investigators on it. What those studies have shown is there can be some positive short-term effects for that, but that kind of brief intervention doesn't seem to have the ability to improve your long-term attentional capacities. If you want the benefits of mindfulness and meditation, which I think there can be benefits to them, you have to go in. You have to go all in on it. So like, if you take the 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction class that was developed by John Kabat-Zinn, who was kind of one of the the leading sort of pioneers in this area, you practice 45 minutes to an hour per day for 8 weeks. Go on a full day, 8-hour retreat. Like, yes, you're going to get benefits from that. But, you know, how willing are people to do that? You know, if this is really important to you and you feel like your attention is diminished in the face of your distractions, I loved it. I absolutely feel more kind of settled and, you know, and have experienced a lot of benefits from it. I just finished it last week. I'd recommend it to anybody. But if you want the benefits, you have to be willing to put in the work. So I think its potential is there, but you got to put in the work.
That sounds really interesting. I've had colleagues who have attended silent meditation retreats where, you know, for up to like sometimes like weeks, there's no talking even, and I'm fascinated by that. I don't know if I could do it. It's something I would love to just try once. Maybe it's sort of like on my bucket list.
Yeah, there are mindfulness-based. Look up MSBR, classes near me. You will probably find one, and the great news is actually they're online. You can. I took mine online. And we met once a week for 2.5 hours. So I really would recommend this to people. But again, you got to be willing to do your homework. But if you do your homework, I think it has the potential to make a difference. I guess the last thing I'll say, Joe, maybe you could give your opinion on this. It does seem that our attentional capacities are somewhat linked with our working memory capacities. And what I've read is that there's not a ton of room to move in that respect, so that like those capacities of our brain maybe are largely given. We can move within a range, but it's not an unlimited range.
So, Jim, I know we talked about you visiting McMaster next year for the next EdCog conference, and you could check out our live lab facility. One of the active areas of research that our lab is looking at is connection between mind wandering, mindfulness, and flow.
Oh, yeah.
And so, maybe this will be the topic for your next book.
Yeah, flow I absolutely love. In fact, that was one of the things I intended to kind of make a big part of the book. I ended up kind of putting it in a bunch of different places, but absolutely, I mean, that's another thing to think about. So if you're looking for things for yourself or for your children, for example, go look at the research on flow and find as many ways as you can to be engaged in flow activities. And again, you'll find it quickly if you Google it what those are. They're different for different people. But the last thing I'll say about it is, whether those activities, I don't know, have the ability to improve somehow expand your attention, I'm not sure. But they do seem to have an improvement on our well-being, right? Like our overall sense of happiness. The more time that we spend in those flow activities, the greater our sense of well-being. So absolutely, they're great things to be doing. My favorite flow activity is golf. I'm a golfer. I can get lost on the golf course for 4 hours and be very happy for for that lasts me for a few days.
I'm going to ask you one final question before we move on to our pub quiz. And we had a number of parents asking, when you talked about this pull of novelty and constantly needing to be stimulated, does that mean that we should actually limit screen time for our children?
I mean, the way I would argue that is the best way for parents to think about this, and I've wrestled with this, for, like I said, 5 children. So and my wife's an educator, so we've talked about this. My view on this is not to be so concerned about timing screen time, although that can be a helpful thing. Instead, make sure there's a lot of outside time, a lot of play time, a lot of like focus instead on making sure they're doing the positive things, like getting outside, exercising, painting, coloring, doing the kinds of things that we know help. Maybe it's getting at the same thing essentially, but I don't like sort of the idea that parents have to like time down to the minute exactly how much time their children are on screens. That's challenging to do. Just make sure every day they're doing some of those things that we know are essential for childhood development. Get outside, be with friends, do creative stuff, get on the floor, that kind of stuff. I think that's would be my view.
All right. Thanks so much, Jim.